Hello there, Peter Mansbridge here. And you're listening to Smoke, Mirrors, and the Truth, the Wednesday episode of The Bridge. Bruce Anderson's in Ottawa. I'm Peter Mansbridge in Toronto. You're listening on Sirius XM, Channel 167, Canada Talks, or on your favorite podcast platform. And normally you would have been watching, some of you, on our YouTube channel, but I forgot to push the button on the first half of our program today. And so we're just getting the second half of it on our YouTube channel. If you're watching this on the YouTube channel, know that the first half, a really good discussion, is available on our podcast platform, and you can download it to hear it. But you get to watch us now for the second half, which is still on the same issue of disinformation and misinformation, conspiracy theories, how to handle it all in a period of, well, we call this program Smoke, Mirrors, and the Truth, and there's a lot of it in all of this. And it does come back to that question. You know, we've had Michelle Rempel-Garner, as you know, Bruce, on this program a number of times in the last 6 months, talking about the work that she and her colleagues from all parties are trying to do in determining how AI is going to be kind of monitored, even regulated in Canada, and whether there should be certain, safety precautions put in, especially on the political front, as you head in towards election campaigns. And I'm not sure how that would work, how that would even be monitored, if in fact that was the direction we ended up going. There is such a thing in Britain, but didn't seem to prevent what happened on Keir Starmer. So I don't know. Where's your head on?
Yeah, we certainly learned from the effort that was made in the last election to monitor and report on the Chinese interference question. We learned that we are nowhere near where we should be in terms of the ability to spot these efforts, and nowhere near where we need to be in terms of the ability to have a public discussion. In effect, and I don't think this was the intention behind the way that effort was designed, but I think it was designed to keep from talking about interference unless the authorities who were looking at the evidence were convinced that interference was so great, so pervasive, that it was going to change the outcome. Now, I can understand the logic behind that, the idea that you don't elevate something so that it becomes a political issue in and of itself if it's not going to have a material impact. But the problem with that approach is, well, who gets to decide what's a material impact? And what if we don't talk about this more? What if more people don't become more anxious that they're being misinformed, that they're being told lies, that they're being convinced of things that aren't true or perhaps relevant to their concerns? The potential to do that is much greater, much more quickly than it ever has been before. And we have a chasm in terms of policy in the area of politics. And what are we going to do about it? And will we talk about it or will we not talk about it? And I think, given that we have minority government in Ottawa, we could have an election at any time. And I don't think we're better equipped to deal with this issue than we were in the last election. And we were poorly equipped to deal with it then. So we do need politicians like Michelle Rempel-Garner and others to step forward, to use their share of voice, to call attention to this risk, and to try to come up with solutions that won't be perfect, that won't be agreed to by everybody, but at least will represent a more significant and useful starting point than what we have right now, which for most reasonable people, if they're paying any attention to this, is quite worrisome, and it should be worrisome.
Do you think they care? I mean, there's so much on the plate right now in terms of issues that should be, and not necessarily are, but should be dominating the discussions that take place in Ottawa, either around the cabinet table or around the caucus table or in the House of Commons. Um, yeah, I got the sense, I certainly got it from the first time we talked to Michelle Rempel, which was 6 or 7 months ago, that it just, there wasn't a lot of knowledge uh, on the part of the 330 whatever MPs in the House of Commons about AI and the impact it could have, the bad impacts that it could have. And while there's more now than there was then in terms of knowledge, there's still doesn't seem to be a front burner issue.
No, it's not. It's not a front burner issue. There is work going on in the background in government. I think that's good. I think that, but I think there's a difference between public policy, the role of government, and artificial intelligence, which is a big and important set of subjects, and the combat of politics. The combat of politics is not going to be easily regulated through broad public policy. The federal government is seeing just how difficult it is to get across the finish line with some of the bills that they put in place or been trying to put in place for several years. Now, I don't think those bills are particularly well designed. I also think that the initial design gets dated very quickly. And so now you've got a situation where the government is being accused, I think quite falsely, of trying to censor what people can traffic as information on the internet. I don't think that's right. I think it's disinformation. I think it's deliberate disinformation, but I also understand that the level of trust of anybody in this area is not what it should be or used to be or needs to be in order for people to say, okay, put in some policies that help protect us all and help create a conversation that's safe and productive for us. People won't agree about that. I had people on Twitter. I'm going to keep calling it Twitter because I don't know why it would be called X. It doesn't make any sense to me. But last night, who were kind of debating kind of ridiculous things. And it just reminded me of this poll that we did a little while ago. And you'll remember this, I think, that 20% of Canadians don't think that humans landed on the moon, that there's lots of people who have come to believe things that aren't true. Politicians know this. They see the evidence. But to your point, they've got so many other things on their to-do list. And it's not clear that if you did care about this, what you could do about it. It's almost like everybody is looking around the world and saying, will somebody please come up with an idea that we can hang our hats on? And maybe that will happen over time. I feel like it was easier to imagine that it will happen before what I generally think of as the world order seemed to be breaking down. But it's also true that at the end of the day, the question of whether or not you can legislate or regulate ethical behavior is a pretty open question. You can try. You should try in some cases. But if people want to do unethical things and don't feel any sanction for doing those, this is the point for politicians, I think, then they will. So I think we need to make sure that we have a good read on the technology, good ideas on the regulatory side, and we need a conversation about ethics that is a kind of a recurring conversation where people keep on reminding themselves that if everybody chose to do the unethical things that were available to them to press the argument that they believe in, we'd all end up in a pretty sorry place.
I was at the University of Toronto yesterday at the Monk School with John Ibbotson, who has got a new book out called The Duel, which is about, it just came out yesterday. And I was interviewing him in front of an audience about this new book. And The Duel is about the Diefenbaker-Pearson years, basically the 10th decade of Canadian politics from the kind of mid-50s to the mid-60s. And It's I really recommend it. It's a fascinating book, and I grew up during that period, thought I knew it pretty well, but there's lots in this book that I hadn't realized. But one of the things I was looking at was the kind of issues they were both these men, which is really the only period in Canadian political history where there have been basically two dynamic personalities on either side of the house who were right through that period, that decade. And both had their time in office as prime minister, both had their time in office as opposition leaders. But you looked at the issues of the day and the way they, in fact, changed Canada as a result of their positions on different issues. But I look at that, and then I look at what we're going through today. And I look at a picture of Trudeau and Polyev and Singh together, and I wonder, like, why would anybody even want to try and lead right now? Because there's such an array of issues on the table. I mean, look at it. You've got, just in the recent weeks, you've got the Canada-India issue. You've got the guy in the house issue. Now you've got a Middle East war going on against all the other things that are constants in our lives right now. A housing crisis unlike anything we faced before, inflation, food prices, grocery prices. You got a war in Ukraine. You've got an uneasy segment of the population that demonstrate, and truck convoys and anti-vax and this and that and the other. There are so many issues in front of the political leaders of the day, and they seem to change like you're watching a pinball machine, right? It just sort of, one bounces off the other. One day you're on this, the next day you're on that, and they're totally separate, and nothing seems to be getting resolved. It's sort of like a crisis of issues, no matter who you are, which side you're on. Nothing seems to be happening. Now, people would say, okay, this is a time for real leadership. People have to step forward, deal with these issues one by one or a number at a time. Sometimes I get carried away with the moment and not realize that, sure, there have been moments like this before, but man, I can't think of anywhere there were so many, didn't mention a bunch, climate change, energy prices, all of this.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of stuff
Yeah,
there.
there's a lot of stuff. And one of the things that I think is kind of unique in all of that is that for most of my life, maybe all of it, the role that the United States played in kind of modulating, organizing conversations wasn't always perfect, wasn't always right, wasn't always appropriate, but it was always there. And you kind of understood America to be a mostly stabilizing force, an authority that could bring parties together to try to reduce tensions, to try to point the world in a safer direction. Now, even as I say that, I sound like I'm kind of glorifying the past role of the United States. But really, the point I'm trying to make is that right now, the rest of the world looks at the United States, if they're paying close attention, as a bit of a failed democracy. It's got two competitors for the highest office, neither of which is well regarded by the broad public, both of whom are seen as past their prime, to put it nicely. And in the case of Trump, for many people, he's not just past his prime, he's just unfit for office by any measure. Of course, we've got other people who think he's the savior of the world and the savior of America. But what does that mean in the end? Well, right now we're seeing the Trump effect, which isn't really about him so much personally, although he's been the leader of it, but it's been about this idea that you can say the most outrageous thing and people will gravitate towards it if they have enough sense of grievance. And if you say it in a way that feels um, familiar and resonant to them. And so the Republicans in Congress can't figure out who their leader's going to be because they can't figure out whether they want to try to play a more, I don't even want to say moderate, because I don't think you could look at McCarthy and say that he was really a moderate, but a more moderate, or you want a more disruptive and radical voice where America is constantly faced with a new deadline about whether or not it's going to fund the functions of government. You've got vacant positions across the top ranks of the military because one senator is holding up the process by which those positions would be filled. Even in the context of this conflagration in the Middle East, he's saying, no, I'm not going to back down. I'm not going to let the president appoint senior officials to the military. And his party seems powerless to rein this guy in. You've got a sense that there's no ability to kind of control the dialogue or to steer the dialogue to a safe place. And you've got a majority of Americans now saying, and a large majority of Republicans saying, let's not send any more money to Ukraine, which is exactly, I'm sure, what Putin has been waiting for, expecting to happen, and will now be taking advantage of. So I know I've just added to the list of headaches that you described, but for me, the shakiness of NATO caused by the United States, the shakiness of the world order caused by kind of a breakdown in the US political consensus of how to deal with Russia, how to deal with China, how to deal with their own internal divisions. We need steadying leadership here in Canada. From whatever side of the aisle, we need steadying leadership, and we need people not to be trying to provoke divisions for the sake of political advantage. And I hope we get it.
Who's the great leader out there right now? I'm not talking about just Canada or the United States or anywhere. Like on the stage, there's always been at least one, if not more than one, of the international leaders you kind of look up to and say, that's a leader, right? I'm not sure you got that anymore. I mean, you got Netanyahu, who is, been around forever, is facing corruption trials, is facing a divided country on the issues of change he wants to make to the judiciary, basically to save his own hide. Now trying to lead a country and a government made up of all sides through a terrible situation. But I couldn't tell you the name of the German leader after Angela Merkel. I probably should know that, but I can't because it hasn't had an impression upon me yet. Britain's been in turmoil for some time on the leadership front. America is America.
No, I think there is no obvious answer to your question. There isn't. And you were saying this before, but it's hard to imagine why people who have a reasonable life and some accomplishments outside of politics would decide to step in to politics now. But we need people to do that, and we need to create a better blend of criticism, constructive criticism, and acceptance of the fact that they're doing jobs that are difficult, and that sometimes they need to make choices that aren't perfect, and that compromise isn't a bad idea. Usually, it's what our democracies are built to try to do. So, in my spare time, I do try to encourage more people to get involved in politics and to help create a next generation of leaders. And I know you do the same thing too. But we all need to take a pause in the relentless criticism of people in public life, regardless of what side of the aisle they're on, unless they're bad actors, in which case we need to call them out. We need to make sure that it's a safe and more productive place for people who are trying to do a good job.
Okay, we're going to leave it at that, at least from the two of us. I know that you, many of you out there, will have views on the various things we've discussed today. So drop me a line at the Mansbridge Podcast at gmail.com, the Mansbridge Podcast at gmail.com. Make sure you include your name and where you're writing from. Love to hear from you. Try and get them in today. We'll see what makes it on the Your Turn program tomorrow, along with the Random Ranter. And for those of you who are watching on YouTube, sorry, my fault, my bad, my incompetence, not pushing the button on time to get the first half. But once again, if you are watching and you saw the second half, you can get the first half on our podcast platform. So thank you, Bruce. Bruce will be back on Friday for a good talk with Chantal Hébert. I'll be back tomorrow with Your Turn. I'm Peter Mansbridge in Toronto. Thanks so much for listening. Talk to you again in 24 hours.